I'd like to take another question, which comes from Jeremy Fernandes. Mr Fernandes, your question, please.
Hi. Scotland won't be able to live off oil and gas forever. What measures will you implement to help the transition?
Thank you very much. Scotland won't be able to live off oil and gas forever. What measures would you implement to help the transition? A good question here in Aberdeen, and we had a lot of interest, of course, from this audience in questions about oil and gas. Nicola Sturgeon.
Let me say two things. Firstly, in an energy sense, we've got to continue to work to make the transition to renewable sources of energy. We had statistics published just a couple of weeks ago that showed that we are now generating something like half of our energy consumption from renewable sources. So really good progress, but we've got work still there to do. But I want to give you this statistic because the second thing we've got to do is make sure we're taking the steps and investing in areas, it goes back in some ways to the previous question, that grow the non-oil parts of our economy. You know, if you look over at the years to the end of this decade, oil revenues are predicted by 2020 to be £3 billion lower than they are just now if the oil price stays at the level it's at just now. But by 2020, our non-oil revenues, our onshore revenues, are predicted to be £15 billion higher than they are today. So we need to invest in the areas that grow the non-oil parts of our economy. That's what we're seeking to do as the Scottish Government, but it's one of the many reasons why lifting austerity, and as the gentleman in the audience says, freeing up resources to invest in the kinds of things that create jobs and get our economy growing. That's what we need to do.
Just to be clear, did you say 2020?
By the end of the decade.
Yeah. So, just to be clear then, I mean, you want Scotland to have control over all taxation, which the figures suggest, you could argue at the moment, Scotland couldn't really afford. Are you saying you want that in 2020, or after now, or when?
I don't think it's any secret that I want Scotland to have as many powers over our own economy and our own fiscal decisions
do you want this?
as soon as possible.
Well, when is that?
As Scotland's voice in the next House of Commons, if the SNP is there in numbers, we'll be arguing for as many powers to come to Scotland
sure,
as
but just on the specific
possible.
point of what you call full fiscal autonomy,
when
do you want
I would
that
like
to come
it as
in?
Quickly as the other parties agree to give it. You probably better ask them when they're going to support it.
Would your MPs vote for it next year?
Yes, I would vote for
full fiscal autonomy.
I would vote for it. Would you support it?
No, I wouldn't.
Absolutely
not.
Let me tell you why. I want to explain what it is. I think it's important, Mr Murphy, hang on, because I think we need to explain, just to be totally clear, full fiscal autonomy, as I understand it, which is being advanced here, is the idea that Scotland has complete control of taxation and spending, and not everything short of defence and foreign affairs. It's such a horrible jargon phrase that I thought we should maybe stick to that.
If you look at the BBC poll today, it's actually an option in Scotland that's rather popular. People want more power.
Let's ask Jim Murphy about it then.
This is the idea that we cut ourselves off from sources of taxation all across the UK. Now, after the difficult time Aberdeen and the north east of Scotland's been through, the idea that we voluntarily give up on the pooling and sharing of resources, the ability to transfer money around these islands, no longer have that basis of supporting the UK state pension and other matters such as that, I don't think it makes sense. I think staying part of the electoral system... There's just one example I'll use to illustrate. Labour's in favour of introducing a mansion tax on properties over £2 million across the UK. To pay, first instalment to pay for 1,000 more NHS nurses in Scotland. Just 1/3 of 1% of that money will be raised in Scotland. But we will get access to tens of millions of pounds of that money because it comes from London and the south east of England. Why would you voluntarily go for this nice-sounding phrase that would be so damaging to Scotland and Scotland's economy?
Okay, I want to get around this panel. No, I'm so sorry, but there's 6 people on the panel. There's 6 people on the panel, and I want to get around them. So let's go around on this point. Ruth Davidson, first of all. And the question was, remember, oil and gas. How will you smooth the transition as it gradually runs out?
Well, we've just given the biggest package to the oil and gas sector. We heard what they were asking for, and £1.3 billion in the last budget to make sure that we help them at this time because they need it. But during the referendum, I challenged Nicola on our £113 $1 per barrel figure on oil and how oil was going to pay for everything. And she told me that I was doing Scotland down by suggesting that that might not always be the case and that I was being pessimistic. But for me, it's actually not about the pounds and the pence. I've got an even more broad view than Jim on this, and that's the United Kingdom is one country, and we voted to stay in it. And as part of that, that means that we are a social union as well as a political union. So yes, I want everybody, whether they're in England, Ireland, Scotland or Wales, to pay into the same pot. And I want a pensioner in Kirkcaldy to get the same state pension as the pensioner in Cardiff, because that's what we voted for. And that's the country that I want to live in.
Thank you very much. We'll go around the panel. Willie, Rennie.
Thank goodness this is just an academic discussion. Just imagine if we had a different vote last September. I think it would be rather more heated. I think there would be blind panic as a result of what's happened in the North Sea. To have our economy, not wholly, but largely dependent on the volatile, falling resource of the North Sea, I think would have caused absolute chaos to our public services, to our pensions, to our teachers, to our hospitals. And Nicola Sturgeon has got the nerve to continue to argue for the policy that was soundly trounced in last year's referendum. I find that galling.
If I could deal with the question of oil as a fossil fuel, because that's what it is, our dependence, our over-dependence on fossil fuel in the age of climate change. The world has, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 4 and 6 times as much fossil fuel as we can afford to burn if we're serious, not about handing on a strong economy, but handing on a livable world to the next generation. So the urgency of that transition really can't be overstated. And my big problem with this whole debate for years, not just during the referendum campaign and since then, has been that I hear other parties vociferously disagreeing about the fact that they support basically the same policy, which is maximum extraction. That's the policy that they all share. What we need to do is maximise revenue in the short term and minimise extraction in the long term.
What will happen to all the jobs here? Mr. Harvie.
We've said very clearly we support a city deal for this region, but it has to be one based on the word you used in the question, transition. It has to be about identifying the skills and the kind of supply chain businesses which are not only relevant today, but which will remain relevant in the area of marine technology and the renewable industries that we're going to see rising. If instead,
140,000.
Ruth, one point, just 1 point. If instead we do what you've suggested and we give tax breaks to the industry for future exploration for reserves that we cannot afford to burn, then we simply dig ourselves deeper into a hole and we will lurch from crisis to crisis to crisis. And one day, the next oil crisis will be the last oil crisis, and we will regret not having acted sooner.
You can come back in a minute, but we haven't heard from Mr. Coburn yet, and I imagine, I'm very sure that our audience have things to say about oil and gas, so put your hands up if you do. We'll go to David Coburn first of all, and then Nicola Sturgeon, and then we'll come out for some points. Mr. Coburn.
Well, as Mr. Rennie said, if we'd listened to the SNP, we'd have been calling in the IMF by now because the oil price has halved. And the good thing about being part of the UK is we can spread the risk right across the UK. So there are some companies who benefit in other parts of the UK from a lower oil price, and that can be used to help support Aberdeen and places that are having trouble at the moment.
Question was about the transition.
We cannot have that if we are not part of the UK. And if we had listened to Ms Sturgeon and her crew, quite frankly, we would have been bankrupt, we would have nothing, the country would be finished. So
the question was
they
about
have no idea about economic.
The question was about the transition.
Transition, we must get support for that, and because we're part of the Greater United Kingdom, that will enable Aberdeen to survive. If we listen to the nonsense of the SNP, we would be bust, and Aberdeen would be too.
Nicola
so they don't know what they're talking about.
Three quick points. Firstly, the Scottish economy is not dependent on oil. Our economic output without oil is the same as the UK's. Second point, there is no oil-producing country in the world that's looking at a lower oil price and saying, oh my goodness, we're no longer capable of running our own economies. You look at Norway, for example. Norway's sitting on an oil fund worth £500 billion because they stewarded their oil resource properly and didn't allow it to be squandered the way ours has. And thirdly and lastly, if you listen to these other parties here, then you get the impression that they think Westminster is some great protection for Scotland's public finances. The cumulative cut to Scotland's public finances over the past few years has been £12 billion.
You want to do 40?
That's the price to Scotland of austerity. So this is a clear choice. This is about taking responsibility for how we manage our own resources, or leaving ourselves at the mercy of continued Westminster cuts. I think taking control ourselves is a much better option.
I think we should ask the people who I imagine know quite a lot. I will come to you, who know quite a lot about oil and gas, and I imagine they are among us here. The woman with blonde hair and the white wristband. Yes, just there.
You said that you wanted to spread the risk over the rest of the UK, but why wouldn't that be the same for spreading the risk over the rest of Europe?
Thank you. And right up. We may come to that. Right up the back. Thank you. Right up the back.
Nicola made the point about putting in new funding to combat potential losses in oil and gas. But why has the Scottish Government strangled funding for the North East of Scotland over the last Parliament? We have nothing else, and they have done nothing to combat it. Another point I have is Nicola says she speaks for Scotland. She doesn't speak for everyone. We've got 5 political parties up here, 6. Everyone has their own political views. Scotland does not have a unique political ideology different from the rest of the UK. That became apparent when we unfortunately voted in a UKIP MEP.
Thank you. Let's go down to the front.
We're in Aberdeen University, which is a research university, and it's one of the most of the Scottish research universities that has a cut in funding from the Scottish Government. Is that going to be reversed? Because Aberdeen needs that research funding to compensate for the fall in oil price.
I'll take one more question and then we'll come back down here. So, yes, in the hat, yes.
We all recognise that we need to move away from fossil fuels, so will the Scottish Government completely ban fracking then, so it doesn't occur in Scotland?
Exactly. OK, thank you very much. Jim Murphy.
Well, I would approach on fracking that says local communities should decide. There should be no fracking in a community unless you have a chance in a local referendum. That would give you the ultimate say. But the most important thing I think that's been said this evening so far, notwithstanding the young lady's kick at UKIP, is Nicola saying that SNP MPs would next year vote for full fiscal autonomy. I wouldn't. Look, Nicola's own financial advisers have said that this is a bad deal for Scotland and leaves a black hole. Scottish business leaders say it would leave a black hole. More importantly, arguably, Scottish trade union leaders have said it would be bad for our economy. So I won't be siding with Nicola's party because I want to keep the Barnett formula. The Barnett formula is fair for Scotland. I want to keep the Barnett formula today, tomorrow and forever. And that's what you get with Labour.
OK. I'll come to you. Yeah. You know, I feel that sometimes we hear Barnett formulas and full fiscal autonomy. The Barnett formula is the mechanism by which Scottish spending is decided at the moment. Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, you know, the whole point of having more control over your economy and your decisions over tax, and remember, having that control is also about having control over employment matters, the minimum wage, the things that help us to get people into jobs and lift people out of poverty. The whole point of that is that you don't accept that you're in deficit forever. You don't accept the inevitability of further Westminster cuts. You take control to try to grow your economy and get your finances into much better shape. The alternative to that is to accept that we will be at the mercy of continued Westminster cuts. Now, I don't think that's the right option for Scotland. Instead, I think we should move to having more control over our own affairs. That's what I will continue to argue. You had the chance to
have these votes in the Scottish Parliament. And when you had the vote in the Scottish Parliament, the SNP voted not to ban the exploitative zero-hours contracts. They voted not to move on the living wage. And you voted also, Nicola, hold on, Nicola, you've had more than enough say. When it came to a vote on those people on the welfare fund, now these are some of the most vulnerable people in our country in the welfare fund. Labour said, let's give them cash payments. The SNP sided with the Tories to give them vouchers.
We set up the welfare fund.
Those people on that welfare fund, when they go for their shopping, they stand in the queue next to you.
That's rubbish.
And embarrassingly, they hand over vouchers for their food. That's a humiliation.
Jim,
and Nicola, that's your fault and your responsibility. And you should be ashamed of yourself for doing that.
You're shamefully using vulnerable people to make a political point there. We set up the welfare fund. We spend £100 million a year mitigating Tory welfare cuts. You stood in the way of devolving welfare powers to the Scottish Parliament. If we were in control of welfare powers, we wouldn't have to mitigate Tory cuts. We could set a decent welfare system for our own so that we could lift these people out of poverty.
Talking about your mistakes isn't about demonising the poor. Making those people on the welfare fund have to rely on vouchers for their food. That's what's unfair for those vulnerable people. Not me reminding you of your record, Nicola.
I don't want to live in a Scotland. I don't want to live in a Scotland where we're having to set up a welfare fund to mitigate against Tory welfare cuts. I want us to have the ability in our own hands to have a decent social security system, so that we have a decent safety net, so that we can lift people out of poverty and people don't have to be relying on a welfare fund at all. That's the kind of Scotland I want to live in.
We've heard a lot from the two people beside me, Ruth Davidson.
You have to be able to fund welfare, and full fiscal autonomy right now, if you voted for it next year, would mean that we had billions of pounds less in Scotland to spend on welfare. In fact, the IFS says it would be £7.6 billion, which is more than we spend on every single pensioner in this country. And that's the other half of the equation, Nicola, that you don't want the people out there to know. It would cost us billions.
I'm sorry, we've heard a lot. I'm sorry, we cannot just stick to the two people in the middle because we have a panel of six.
I think what Nicola needs to accept is that she lost the referendum last year, and she needs to stop revisiting this argument. And also what we need is to recognise that we have got many more powers coming to the Scottish Parliament, thanks to the vow that we made, and we are going to deliver on that.
OK, I'm going to take another question because I think this is where the debate will roll on. Very quickly, one sentence.
The one thing Nicola does not tell you about is that she wanted to be part of Europe and out of the UK and into the European Union. Quite frankly, the decisions, 70% of decisions are made in Europe, in Brussels, not here in Scotland, not here in Westminster. We need to bring the powers back to this country.
We may come to that.